A lot of the challenges that mothers describe talking about it today have to actually do with the way that motherhood is structured, so the environment that they're mothering within, and has to do with the expectations that are placed on them and that they place on themselves in the role of mother and what it means to be a good mum.
Hello and welcome to the Empowered Woman podcast with me, Kieran Vryn. In this final episode of maternal season, I'm joined all the way from Sydney by Motherhood Studies Sociologist Dr. Sophie Brock. In this conversation, Sophie explains how the social construct of motherhood, or the Institute of Motherhood, contributes or impacts our experience of mothering. Sophie explains how our identity as mothers is shaped by things like the good mother myth and other societal expectations. Sophie also hosts the podcast, The Good Enough Mother. Hi, Sophie, and thank you for joining me on my podcast, The Empowered Woman. Start off, if you would, by telling us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, Kira. I am a Motherhood Studies Sociologist. And so what that means is basically like a scientist who studies society and the relationship that mothers have to society. And so I spend the majority of my time providing professional development to people who work supporting mums, like psychologists and coaches and counselors. And I teach them the discipline of the sociology of motherhood and motherhood studies, and bringing this social lens to conversations about what it means to be a mum in society today.
So I suppose we'll start there then, Sophie. What does it mean to be a mum in today's society?
Yeah, so I think it's usually helpful to start off with a few distinctions in language about what we're talking about when we say mothers and mum and motherhood. And so part of the first place to start in understanding the sociology of motherhood is to recognize that we exist within a social world, and as mothers, we live within it. And so I use this analogy of a fish tank to help describe this and make it a bit more tangible. And the idea is that you have this round glass fish tank, which represents the society in which we live. And that is actually our institutions and our structures. And so all of us within society are impacted in some way by the structures that we live within. So for me, I send my daughter to school. So we're impacted by the schooling system. We're impacted by the healthcare system. We're impacted by our economic system. And the family unit is also a social system. So we are the fish inside the tank, the mothers who are swimming around doing our mothering. And that is a practice. So mothering is a verb. It's something that we do. So we've got motherhood, which is the structure that we live within. Mothering is the doing work of caring for our kids. And then mother is the social role or the identity. And it's a social role which has attached to it particular expectations about what it means to be a good mum. And a lot of the challenges that mothers describe talking about it today have to actually do with the way that motherhood is structured, so the environment that they're mothering within, and has to do with the expectations that are placed on them and that they place on themselves in the role of mother and what it means to be a good mum. And all of this is happening within that water, which is representative of our culture, that is flavored by these expectations. So it's a very layered definition, and it's one that I know can sometimes be a little bit of a head spin initially when somebody hasn't had any orientation to social science or talking about mothering and motherhood in this way, but that's the kind of lens that I use to explore these themes.
And so if we take that we're influenced by these structures, how do those structures influence, I suppose, motherhood as a construct and our mothering?
Yeah, so the structure is motherhood as a construct. So that's what it is. So when we say motherhood, we're talking about Adrienne Rich defined it as the institution of motherhood. So we could talk about it as the institution of motherhood, or the social construct of motherhood, or the tank, as I kind of refer to it shorthand. And some examples of how that impacts us as mothers is if you live within a country that doesn't have any paid parental leave, that is something that is embedded within the structure that you are living living within, and that will shape your experience as a mum. If you are living in a place where you look at what the outcomes are from birth, in our context that I'm talking from in Australia, we have statistics of around 1 in 3 mothers experience birth trauma, around 1 in 10 come out with PTSD for various reasons. But a big theme that is more and more explored is that of obstetric violence, for example,
Mhm.
within hospital settings. And so you look at a variety of different intersections that we experience as mothers when we are going through either pregnancy, birth, early mothering experiences, moving into if you have a child who has additional needs or a disability, if you're a mother with additional needs or a disability, if you're a mother who experiences systemic racism, if you're a single mother, if you're a lesbian mother, if you're a mother that is positioned in any way socially outside of what is expected to be the norm of this perfect
Yeah.
mother myth, then you will experience challenge in some way. And I think many of the challenges mothers describe most commonly, particularly in Western society, are ones that have to do with structural failings. So many
Mhm.
mothers talk about feeling guilty. So many mothers struggle with their mental health. So many mothers struggle with this so-called balance between care and career. I talk about as the care career conundrum. And part of what I hope we can do in bringing in some of this education piece around the sociology of motherhood and motherhood studies is to help mothers contextualize their experience and understand
Yeah.
that a lot of the time what we individually struggle with actually has roots in social structure.
And talk to me then about that piece of the myth of the good mother, where it came from, and the structure of motherhood that we're living in now. Where or how did that come about? When or how did that come about?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that probably anthropologists are better placed to answer than
Mhm.
than I am and historians. But as human beings, we exist within this nexus of like society and the structures that we live within and individuals. And sociology at the heart of it is about exploring that connection. And so we, in many ways, as human beings, we're interrelational, interdependent. Like we need structure. We are social creatures. So we're not saying that structure is bad or wrong, but we're exploring what that structure has come to be and where it's come from. I think that if we look at historically at mothers in different time periods, we can look at different factors that may influence them in different cultural settings and historical settings. I think religion and religious institutions has probably had a big part to play here in defining what it means to be a good mother or self-sacrificial mother in particular contexts. Certainly, a political climate has a big impact, an economic climate has a big impact. Here in Australia, for example, post World War II, there was a propaganda campaign that was initiated when we had the soldiers returning from war, and there were many women who had stepped into paid work
Yeah.
positions, and they needed to kind of have some of those positions exited for those who were coming back from the war. And so there was this propaganda campaign that really idealized the myth of the stay-at-home mum, and that was the best thing for children, I should say. And this is spoken about in literature as the kind of the mum with the apple pie at the end of the day and the happy homemaker. And that was deliberately pushed as an ideology to try and serve a political and economic purpose. And so sometimes it's not necessarily as deliberate as that. And there are maternal historians that trace this. But I think it's from a variety of different factors. It's always intersectional, looking at the different ways that historical events have come to shape mothers'
Mhm.
experiences. Certainly, the pandemic has been a big one more
Yeah.
recently from mothers in going, well, what does it mean to be a good mother during a global pandemic? What does it mean to have to homeschool my children? What does it mean to have to try and juggle Zoom calls while also looking after a baby or a toddler or my 8-year-old trying to do their schoolwork on a laptop? So certainly our environment is always going to be shaping what it means to be a good mum, and that morphs and changes, which is why it can sometimes feel so hard to escape.
Yeah. And how does that construction or living within structures, with the perception of motherhood, how does that impact us as mothers?
So it starts impacting us when we're children. So the process of socialization is what I'm talking about here. So
Yeah.
it's not as if we become mothers and we have our babies in our arms, and then all of a sudden someone comes and tells us all these rules about what it's meant to be a good mum. Sometimes a variation of that can exist, actually, if you have received
Mhm.
judgment early in your motherhood about how you're meant to feed your baby or how you're meant to support your baby to sleep or not. So sometimes this can come quite explicitly, but we've been through a process of socialization from when we're little girls about what it means to be a good girl. And if we think about some of the messages and we look at the research to see some of the messages that are given and the language that is used to describe like little baby girls versus little baby boys, right?
Yeah.
There's gendered language at play here, focusing for boys on strength, on autonomy, on agency, on what they can do, on independence. And, this is where there's a lot of research and work out there in the space of like toxic masculinity and the ways in which this is really
Mhm.
harmful for boys and men. And when we look at how this plays out for little girls, there is so much there around being quiet, being small, being objectified, right? You're being valued based on how you look and how you can serve others rather than
Mhm.
for the qualities that you have as a person yourself, right? So if we have a look at the way that gendered socialization operates, that actually sets us up for this experience when we transition into becoming mothers.
Mhm.
We have been uh, really the foundation has been laid already for us to move into this intensified space of kind of martyrdom, self-sacrifice, and selflessness. This idea that to be a good mum, you're less of yourself. You put yourself last. You look after everybody else and your needs come last. And so this happens through like a specific process that, we probably don't have time to fully go into, but it is a process that's mapped out and it happens socially, psychologically, and it
Mhm.
happens through relationships as well. So it's complicated because sometimes when we are talking about, or I might critique some of the shoulds of the perfect mother myth, which we could talk about, sometimes it can feel quite personal in a sense of, well, but that's what I believe it means to be a good mum. So sometimes we can be so strongly attached to some of these ideals and we've absorbed them so deeply and we've become so entwined within them that it can feel hard to separate from us. And that's a normal part of this process. And the point of this whole kind of conversation and this whole discipline and area of interest is really for us to be able to have more agency and choice about the type of mother we want to be, the type
Yeah.
of life we want to lead, and to break down shame and guilt that so
Mhm.
often pervade our experiences of being mums.
Yeah, that's it. Well, tell me, Sophie, what is the good mother myth?
So the good mother myth, it's a social construct and ideology. So it changes over time. If
Mhm.
we think back to that analogy of the fish tank that I spoke about, we can imagine getting out a big black texter and writing on the tank all of the rules that we are swimming around, surrounded by. And so if we were to do a little bit of a thought experiment and say, okay, if we had an alien drop down from outer space and they said, can you please paint me a picture of what your society thinks a good mum is? Right. So we're not asking, what do you personally value as a mum? We're saying,
Mhm.
paint me a picture of what the world says a good mum is. But this will vary culture to culture. So
Yeah.
there are going to be differences there in how we answer this question. But talking from my context in Australia and one that is pretty common amongst Western countries, there are these ideologies of self-sacrifice quite
Mhm.
strongly, that to be a good mum means that you put yourself last, you put your children first, and actually usually everyone else in the household and in the family dynamic first before you. There are expectations about how you're meant to become a mother.
Mhm.
So a particular age range, right? You're not
Yeah.
a teenager, so you're not too young, but then you're not too old and you haven't left it too late. So you're within a particular age range and you are assumed to have yearned for and wanted to become a mother. So it's a
Mhm.
conscious choice and something that you planned. You are set up in a particular way financially. You're assumed to be middle class. You're presumed to be in a relationship, generally married, in a heterosexual, monogamous relationship.
Yeah.
You're presumed to be white, right? The idealized image of the perfect mum is put on a pedestal as a white woman who is able-bodied, who doesn't have disability, who has children who fit within markers of good, right? She has the for a start, she has the glowing pregnancy. She
Mm.
has the perfect birth. She has the perfect feeding journey, because that can morph. Sometimes it's all about you
Yeah.
need to breastfeed to be a good mum. Other times
Yeah.
it's actually, no, you can't. You're supposed to bottle feed. And she has the perfect sleeping baby. Her baby is settled, and that's because she's such a good mum. She has a well-mannered, well-behaved toddler who doesn't tantrum. She has children who perform exceptionally in their academics at school and extracurricular activities and get good grades, and they are seen as a reflection on her. And
Mm.
so this sets up our children actually to be in this dynamic where they are objectified and they're seen as commodities. They're something that reflect how good of a job we're doing as mothers, and this sets us up for mother blame, right? So this sense of guilt that can pervade embarrassment, shame, if your children behave in a way that is actually probably developmentally really typical and expected, but is outside of the boundaries of what is expected in our social norms. And so that reflects back on the mother. A perfect mother myth also includes the way a mother should feel or not feel. So she's supposed to feel composed and
Yeah.
satisfied and happy and lit up and patient and calm and loving. She's supposed to appreciate every moment and feel the gratitude because she knows it goes by so fast. She's not expected, or there's no space really for her anger, for her rage, for her apathy, resentment, for some mothers, regret, boredom, right? And part of what I hope we can point out here is that this image and this archetype of the perfect mother myth, it's a caricature. It
Yeah.
is this two-dimensional kind of printout cartoon of who a mum is meant to be, and it doesn't contain space for nuance. It doesn't contain space for ambivalence, which is a normal human emotion, feeling multiple
Mhm.
competing things at once. And it doesn't create any space for a mother's humanity, right? We don't just become mothers and stop being human. And it's very healthy and normal for us to feel a wide range of emotions, especially when we are stepping into this role, which is so potent and powerful and layered and complex, and is also embedded within these very constraining and challenging social contexts as well. So I know that's a big answer to your question, but we could talk,
Yeah.
for a long time about the perfect mother myth or the good mum concept. And I want to point to a couple of scholars in the area as well who conceptualize this. Dr. Sharon Hayes wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood in the early 1990s, and she talked about intensive mothering ideology,
Yeah.
which is similar to the perfect mother myth. And there have been other scholars, Kate Haput, Susan Goodwin. There have been lots of maternal scholars who have written about either the perfect mother myth or the good mum concept in various ways. So it has a long history, but it's always adapting and changing according to what is happening in our culture at that time.
At that time, yeah. And how does that impact? So, living in that fish tank with all of those rules, how does that impact our experience of mothering, the doing?
Yeah, it impacts the experience by placing intensified expectations on what mothering is even defined as. So, if
Yeah.
we look back a few generations, the practice of mothering was seen largely to be about keeping your children safe, well fed, clothed, groomed in a particular way for them to present in a particular way.
Mm.
We had a saying here in Australia, I don't know if it's in your context too, but children are to be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
So there was this, that's something that my mum's generation grew up with. And so the expectations on what it meant to mother was very different. Now, I think there are more intensified expectations about our engagement with our children. So, our responsibility for their emotional landscape and
Yes.
regulation and experience, our sense of responsibility in terms of providing educational stimulus, playing with them, providing them particular opportunities to support their development and well-being.
Hmm.
There's just a lot more. There's a lot more loaded onto mothers today, I think, when it comes to that mothering piece, and that's where Sharon Hayes was kind of pointing towards in the early 90s with intensive mothering ideology. So I think that it can manifest in a variety of different ways. But what we do know is that this has a significant impact on mothers' mental health and well-being. So
Mm.
there's been research looking at mothers who and look, it's never one way, so
Yeah.
a mother may, on one level, have and internalized this intensive ideal that, for example, in order to be a good mum, she needs to cook from scratch for her kids all the time. So she's a terrible mum if she feeds her children any frozen foods. And this becomes a source of stress and anxiety for her. And, I've got the raised hand. That's right. For those who are listening on audio. And so this becomes something that is really impacts her day-to-day experience because her children have got to be fed 3 times a day at least, and it becomes and that's something that, we could work with a mother with to kind of explore where that comes from. What was her own experience of being mothered? Why is this important to her? Where did these messages come about? And what does it mean if we kind of loosen our grip on some of them? Like, there's a whole bunch of things we could do there. But so in one sense, a mother may be impacted by intensive mothering ideology in that way. But then in another way, she may rebel against it. So, for example, that a mother is expected to have, in order to be a good mum, you're expected to have a clean and tidy, presentable house at all times. Like, she may rebel against that and go, you know what? That is not for me. So we have this relationship with these ideologies, and this is what we're wanting to cultivate more of, actually, is awareness of how, when I say ideologies, like how shoulds and external expectations have made their way into our heads, and what is it that we actually value and see as important for us and our family, and what is it here that is perhaps not ours to carry. And so we know, in broad speaking terms, the research shows that the more a mother internalizes intensive mothering ideology, or the more that she identifies with this perfect mother myth, the more likely it will be that she will struggle with anxiety and depression, experience lower life satisfaction and well-being. So it has, significant impacts on maternal mental health. And so that's a big reason why I think it's so important to name the fact that this exists, and for mothers to know that they're not alone with this.
And in your line of work, what would be one of the most either common or surprising things that you would see come up for a mother in this living up to the ideal of the good mother?
Common or surprising in what way? In terms of how it manifests as an impact in her life?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, that's it.
okay. Um, I think anecdotally, from my own experience, the majority of work I'm doing now is with practitioners, so people who support mothers, and the majority of them are mothers. And so probably the theme that comes up most often actually is the ways in which this ideology plays out for mothers who support other mothers, because they can intensify the shoulds on themselves because they're in this line of work. So if I'm a perinatal psychologist and I become a mother and then I struggle with that transition, well, I feel more guilt and shame. And this says something about my sense of self-concept and identity, not only as a mother, but as a professional, because I'm meant to know how to do this. So, I think it's quite common as well for the theme of perfectionism to come up, especially for mothers who may have come to become mothers later in life, right? So if they've had an established career already, if they've gone through an infertility journey in order to try and become a mother, if they've gone through IVF, for example, they can, this is anecdotally from my observations, like there can sometimes be greater um, sort of guilt or shame or shoulding or grappling with the existence of conflicting feelings because we had such a yearning, or there may have been a build-up of expectation and hope in a particular way, and then there can be this real struggle with the reality, and it's never feeling one way. This is why for so many mothers, before they describe a challenge that they may want to voice as part of their mothering experience or their identity or role as a mum, that will preface it with saying, but I love my children. Like, I love my children, but and this is because, right, we have this sensitivity and this knowledge that on some level, if we talk about mothering and our experiences of motherhood in any way other than it being blissful, that we may be positioned as a bad mother. We may be positioned as, well, you're not grateful enough, or are you saying you don't want this? So I think that that's really telling, and it's so important for us to have spaces where we can open up and speak honestly about our experiences.
It is one of those unwritten things that you shouldn't say anything bad. I remember my own experience. My little boy didn't sleep for about 2 years. And when I say didn't sleep, I don't mean like just woke once or twice or 3 times a night. This was constant waking, like 7, 8, 9 times. Sometimes he'd be awake in the middle of the night for 2 or 3 hours, and you're trying to function in that. And there were some people who, when I would talk about that and say how tired I was and how awful it was, they'd be like, oh, it's just a phase. Oh, you'll be grand. You'll get over it. And it's like, you feel completely shut down. Oh, they're only little for so long. Don't worry about it. You know, your experience in all of that is completely dismissed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it can, a lot of the times, I think some of those comments are examples of a couple of things. Like one is social scripts. So we have certain social scripts that kick in to
Yeah.
reinforce socialization and reinforce the perfect mother myth. And so we will all do that. You know, I sometimes
Yeah.
catch myself repeating a
Yeah.
social script. I'm like, oh, wow, where did that come from? So bringing awareness to when that may happen. And so that is one function. And I think the other can be that when comments like that come from particularly other mothers or mothers of different generations,
Yeah.
it can be an indicator actually of their own grief or being unseen in their experience, and that they never had the space and opportunity to really name and talk about what it was really like for them. And they were
Yeah.
told this narrative to tell themselves that you need to be grateful, just get on with it. This is what it means to be a mum. And so I think it's complicated, but it really shows you how important it is for us to be able to feel heard. And when we're in a stage of mothering, regardless of how long that lasts, we don't know it'll end. And you know, I had a similar experience with my daughter. Ended up discovering it was kind of a range of health issues impacting her sleep, but she also didn't sleep for years. And
Yeah.
I went for, you know, like 4 years without sleeping more than 5 hours straight. And that has, I'm
Yeah.
still dealing with the implications of that. And she's almost
Uh-huh.
9. So
Yeah.
I think that the impacts on mothers' health and well-being is understated.
Yes.
We don't have recognition of the repercussions of mothers not being well. You know, and
Uh-huh.
when mothers are not well and when mothers are not thriving, everyone actually pays a price for that. But
Yeah.
it's easier for people to turn the other way because we somehow keep getting on with it. And a lot of the times it's because we don't have a choice, we're not resourced, but we pay
Yeah.
a price for that.
Yeah, we do through our health. It's really interesting, the social scripts. And one of the women I spoke to earlier on in this season, she is an artist, Emily. She was also a midwife before becoming a mother. And she said that it got to the point one of her, I think it was her firstborn, had colic. And so she had a pretty tough experience. And it got to the point where she stopped telling people that everything was okay, that when somebody asked her, she would say, no, it's awful. I'm really struggling. And she said she was met with shock and disbelief and silence, and that people didn't know what to say, and that she'd just stand there in that discomfort and let them feel their own discomfort. And I thought, wow, that was a really powerful thing to do, and to feel, I suppose, strong enough to do that.
Yeah, it takes a lot of vulnerability, you know, to do that. And I think it's
Mm,
also because as a culture, and I'm speaking, you know, in really broad terms here, like
yeah,
we don't have enough ritual and we don't have enough understanding of what this transition requires. And it's
yeah,
also a reflection of the erosion of communal ties and relational ties, that we don't know how to properly support mothers, right?
yeah,
Because this hasn't been modeled for us. And many of us as mothers, we're figuring out as we go. In many ways, actually, that's how everyone has always mothered, but they've
mhm,
done so in community where they've seen what it means to mother. They've seen babies breastfeeding, you know, since as long as they could remember. They've seen that.
yeah,
They've changed babies' nappies and clothes and bathed babies many, many times before they become mothers themselves. But this isn't the case for so many mothers now. Like we're not embedded within communal, relational, familial networks. And that's a result of a whole bunch of bigger social processes that have happened. But I think that example you've given of, you know, you're sharing like, no, I'm not okay. And people don't know what to do with that. It's because
yeah,
there's been no pattern to know how to deal with that.
yeah, that's it. And the also saying that mothering comes naturally. Um, what does that do to a woman who feels perhaps it didn't come naturally to me?
Yeah, I mean, it always depends on what the context is, on what when that's said, who it's said by, and how the mother receives it. I think that sometimes it can be said in a way that feels very dismissive, and there
Mm,
can be this idea that because I'm a woman, I ought to know how to caregive and mother. And if I struggle in some way, then maybe I wasn't meant to be a mother. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe that means I'm not a good mum. And so, interestingly, there's been a lot of work done on this. Dr. Jodie Polutsky is a neuroscientist and a therapist who works with mothers, and she has spoken about this quite extensively when looking at the maternal brain, and says that the maternal brain is primed for learning
mhm.
caregiving. So, when you are in the experience of early postpartum, like things happen in the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist to go and interview Jodie, but things happen in the brain, which sets us up to receive and be open to new learning of maternal behaviors and caregiving behaviors. But that has to come in context of support,
Yeah.
modeling, and relationships. And she found actually in other research, Dr. Sarah McKay is an Australian neuroscientist who writes on this too, has found that other caregivers and dads, for example, like their brain will also rewire
Mm,
to the extent to which they actively engage in the caregiving. So they
yeah.
have to actually be doing it in order for those brain changes to happen. And so I think sometimes actually just a bit of this education piece on understanding about what happens to the brain, what happens to your body, what happens hormonally, what happens
Mhm.
chemically, as well as what we're set up for socially and relationally in this
Yeah.
sociology of motherhood piece, like bringing those pieces of information in from mothers can be really validating and reassuring, and to know that there is nothing wrong with you. You are actually probably having a pretty normal,
Yeah.
predictable reaction to the context and experiences that you have been embedded within and are going through. And
Mm,
so when we receive comments or we hear things like this about, well, it came naturally to me, or why didn't it come naturally to you, just to get curious about that. And I always say
yeah.
to, people that I'm teaching, like, let's cultivate our sociological glasses and or put on our sociological hats and just kind of get curious and go, oh, I wonder what that is saying about our culture. I wonder if that's a social script. I wonder what the function of that is. Is the function of that to make me feel more shame or more empowered as a mother? And maternal competence is really important, and it's undermined at every turn for mothers, I think,
Yeah.
in our current context.
Yeah. And I think the fact that we're starting to talk a bit more about matrescence now and starting to understand it a bit better, that it gives us not only the lens through which to view what we're going through, but also like a big container to hold it all for us and to, I suppose, feel our way through it in a way that works for us and not in the way that we feel we should be existing within it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about a reclamation of identity, right? And
Mm,
breaking of shame, knowing that what you're going through, it's not because you're broken, it's not because you're not good enough, it's not because you didn't prepare enough, it's not because of something that you did or didn't do.
yeah.
In many ways, you've been set up for a particular type of experience, and with that can come a lot of validation and reassurance and a sense of I'm not alone in this, and that can be really validating. But what can also come with it is a lot of anger and grief, a
Yeah.
sense of betrayal, a sense of being gaslit into this experience, a sense of feeling robbed sometimes. So there's a whole variety of feelings that can arise. And I think that it's important to know that, yes, we do have agency and power here. Like it doesn't help us, I don't think, to stay in the place of going, well, I've been set up for this, and here's the fish tank that I'm living within. And that means
Mm,
this is how it's going to be for me, and
yeah.
I can't escape it. It's remembering that we've got agency within that tank. And even though we are within certain confines and constraints, that there are ways we can move within that. And the beginning place for that is to be exposing ourselves to conversations like this and asking ourselves some of these questions and connecting in with what we do find intriguing, and that spikes our curiosity,
Yeah.
and remembering that we are whole and we are not just a role, and
Mm,
we are not a collection of other people's expectations.
yeah.
We are really multi-layered and complex, and creating spaces and finding people that we can talk to about that is a really important first step in feeling like we can reclaim our motherhood experience.
And just talk to me a bit about that. ambivalence, the emotional ambivalence in motherhood? And I suppose explain it for people who maybe haven't come across it.
Yeah, sure. So maternal ambivalence is a concept that sometimes is misunderstood because I think ambivalence can sound like ambiguity. So it
Yeah.
can sound like I'm saying, oh, I don't know what I feel, or I feel a bit ambivalent about that. But in the way that it is defined, maternal ambivalence is feeling multiple, conflicting, competing feelings at once. And there have been many maternal scholars who've written on this. Rosika Parker is an important figure in this space, and also more recently, Dr. Margot Lowy has written 2 books on maternal ambivalence. And so I'd encourage people to go and check out her work. Uh, Maternal ambivalence is really normal. It's expected, and in many ways, it's experienced actually by every single mother in some
Mm.
way. And so, an example of this can be I feel completely fulfilled in my role and experience as a mother. I've never felt more alive and expansive and creative. And also, I feel completely drained. And
Yeah.
sometimes I feel oppressed and compressed and rigid. And sometimes I feel like I just want to walk out the door and I need to get
Mm.
as far away from my children as I can. And then I also feel like I want to consume them and I can't be any closer to them if I tried, right? I love this experience and I also resent this experience.
Yeah.
We can feel multiple things, and this ambivalence can be sometimes about your relationships, but it can be about the role of mother as well. And that's why I think it can be useful to bring in this variety of language
Mm.
between motherhood, the construct, and mother, the role or identity, and mothering, the practice, because there's elements of motherhood we can critique and say, you know what, I reject motherhood. I find that motherhood piece like constraining and oppressive, and it does not define me. Like it does
Yeah.
not represent me, and it's made my life harder. Right? And then also there are parts of mothering the practice that I love, that I get so much enjoyment out of, and I feel so excited by and elated by. There are parts of mothering that is boring, that I get no
Mm.
fulfillment out of, that I do basically because I have to look after my children. And we can talk about this in terms of the identity of mother too. And in my PhD research, I looked at this specifically from mums who have kids with disabilities and found that when it came to this sense of self-concept and identity, women do relate to it in very different ways. Some will say, I am a mother, that is who I am, and that role is all of me. Like I cannot separate myself from mother. Like that is who I am. And then other mothers will describe it really differently and say, I am made up of a collection of different roles, and
Mhm.
mother is one of them. Some will say that I carry my mothering self with me in different parts of my life and it's there in the background, but I actually kind of pull it into the shadows sometimes and then I bring it forth when I'm with my children. So we describe it in different ways because, there's a lot of variety of ways that we relate to who we are as individuals and as
Yeah.
people. So that's something that I think is really exciting as an opportunity for us to explore as mothers, is to kind of sit with this reflection of like, who am I? Who am I as a person, as an individual, as a woman, as a mother? And what does that mean to me? And
Yeah.
how has that shifted since I've had children?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So finally, I just want to ask you, in all of that, um, how do we take our power back? And I know by understanding, particularly the maternal ambivalence piece, and starting to understand that becoming a mother is a massive developmental transition, and that can start to give us our power back. But are there other ways we can take our power back from the social construct, I suppose?
Yeah, yep, there are. So look, in going back to that fish tank analogy, there are ways in which we can mother against the tank. So I talk about this as basically, imagining the little fish ramming the tank. That's what one student brought this up with me years ago. She's like, we're ramming the tank and creating cracks. I would say that it's very hard to talk about reclamation of power. um, I don't think we can really talk about reclamation of power without understanding the ways that power is embedded within hierarchy. So the reclaiming of power in some sense like needs to happen collectively, needs to happen on a social level. It's not something that we can throw individualistic solutions onto because it's not being caused by an individual problem. It's a social one.
Yeah.
So kind of with that caveat, then to make it maybe a little bit more tangible or practical is to think about the ways that you actually already fall outside of the myth. And so usually for mothers, this is connected somewhat with some sense of guilt initially. But the ways that we fall outside of the myth can become openings to our reclamation of power. And why I'm saying this is because there's been research looking at, for example, teenage mums, and they've said that actually they've gone along to the mother and baby groups that were in their community, and they felt an outsider because they were a completely different life stage and completely different to everyone there, and were kind of like, well, I'm going to have to kind of figure this out and create my own path here because I don't fit within what I'm expected to be. There's a whole history of Black feminist scholarship and Black maternal thinkers and writers who talk about this in the context of saying when you're mothering within a racist society, the act of mothering is a reclamation of power because it's about the survival and protection of my children. And so looking at your social context, how you're positioned within it, and the ways in which the places we actually fall outside of the socially dominant norm can be places where we can do some of that reclaiming. But it's layered because you're also experiencing oppression at the same time. But in my experience as a single mother, that's something that I've tried to cultivate in going, okay, well, I may fall outside of the norm in these various ways, but then how can I kind of use that to my advantage? Like, how can I go, well, all right then. And there's this passage in Adrienne Rich's book of Woman Born, and she doesn't talk that much in the book about empowered mothering, but this is one section where she does. And, I'm paraphrasing, but she essentially says that she was driving back she'd taken her, I think, 3 sons to a drive-in movie, and she was away from her husband and they were out of town. And she described this feeling of freedom and liberation that, we broke the rules, like we broke all the rules. We were out late and we broke the rules. And Professor Andrea O'Reilly, who created motherhood studies as a discipline, has quoted that piece, and she's written a book called Mother Outlaws. And so she talks about this as, how can we be mother outlaws? How can we be rebellious mothers? How can we be empowered mothers? How can we take back our agency? And what can that look like for us as individuals? And how can we start kind of sharing our mother outlaw stories with each other of when we did feel freedom in our mothering, when we did feel like it was ours to own and claim and create. And so I think bringing mothers together to be able to have these conversations and share these experiences is a big step in this process too.
That's all for this week and this season. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying these conversations, please like, follow and share the podcast so others can benefit too. My name is Ciara and I'm a life coach who supports women to thrive personally and professionally. I offer one-to-one coaching sessions or monthly coaching memberships through the Women's Collective by BU Coaching, and you can find the details of those services attached to this podcast.